Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're feeling energized and ready to continue this professional development session. Our next panel of the day is titled Updating the Arsenal of Democracy, Co-Production with Allies. Ms. Heidi Grant will moderate this discussion. Ms. Grant is the President and CEO of Heidi Grant Global, providing executive consulting and advisory services for large and small businesses and government-related organizations. Previously, during her 32 years in the DoD, her roles included Director of Resources, J8 for U.S. CENTCOM and AFRICOM, Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs with the Air Force, and Director of the Defense Technology Security Administration and the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. She later became President and Business Development Lead for Boeing Defense Space Security and Boeing Global Services. Heidi, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for your endurance here, your second to last panel. I was told that I could get up and do a dance to keep everybody entertained, but I'll spare you from that. But again, thanks for being here. You can tell by many of the speakers over the last couple days, a lot of them talked about this co-production. They talked about our industrial base. This is a hot topic right now as we look at our current challenges with the complex security challenges, looking at the global security environment right now. There's no more important time than now to discuss how do we work closer with our allies as far as renewing, modernizing our defense industrial base. So we're lucky today, and again, when you saw the comment here, the title, I talk about industrial base, also referred to the arsenal of democracy. This was US President Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy after World War II. So we're going to talk about today, we've got a panel here of distinguished leaders and a variety from the US, we have from Sweden, we have somebody who worked at Africa Command, operational experience. So their bios, their in-depth bios are in the app and in the material that was given out, but what I'm going to do is give each of them a minute just to talk a little bit about what they're doing today and the relevance to the topic that we're going to talk about. So, Mr. Mason, if I could start with you a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, great. So I am just really pleased to be here, and thank you to AUSA for hosting this tremendous event and the opportunity to interface with industry and our allies and partners. So I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Defense Exports and Cooperation, really a long title that boils down to all of the international work we do for foreign military sales, armaments cooperation, exportability, and industrial cooperation as well. So when you look at not just, I will say, the modality of selling something to a country, it's really about how do we work collaboratively with them, whether it is in a co-development, co-production, or co-sustainment environment, such that we can meet the goals and objectives that we collectively share. So I look forward to the discussion and the dialogue and your questions today. And thanks again for allowing me to be part of this panel.
Thanks, Mr. Mason. Ms. Hagwall, can you tell a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, and thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and taking part in this excellent panel. My name is Eva Hagwall. I'm the Deputy Director General at the Swedish Defense Material Agency, or Defense Material Administration. I've been the Deputy Director General there for the last 5 years, and I'm also the Acting National Armament Director. Before coming to the FMV, I was working at the Ministry of Finance as an advisor to the Minister of Finance, of course, working with defense-related matters at the Ministry of Finance. But the last 5 years with defense material, challenging years, interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to share and to learn more from you all in the audience and together in the panel.
Thank you for that. So, Mr. Retired Lieutenant General Smith, please.
Heidi, thanks. So I've been asked a couple of times, why is a retired Air Force 3-star at the LANDEURO conference? And coming from AFRICOM as well. So I did just retire just over a year ago. Grown kids, and my wife and I decided we wanted to stay in Europe. So we immigrated to Norway. So I live just south of Oslo now. And we did that because we really enjoyed living in Europe for our time in Stuttgart, but I also wanted to stay part of these types of conversations. And I very much enjoy thinking about what does that mean, the arsenal of democracy, specifically with regards to capabilities. So I've been working with, whether it's NATO as a contractor through a couple of different primes as advisor or mentor, and also with some startups and venture capital funds and firms on thinking about how do they address those capabilities. So I think there's a good conversation to have about how do we think about including those types of capabilities that those startups are looking, this very small companies are looking to get into this field.
Thank you for that. So, Mr. Mason, we're going to start with you, since you're the closest here to me to my right. So can you just tell us, what does updating the arsenal of democracy mean in today's context, and how does co-production with allies help us to achieve that goal?
Yeah, thanks. And certainly, Heidi, you talked a little bit about the roots of the origin of arsenal democracy, really dating back to World War II and FDR when he coined that phrase to really unleash the industrial capacity and grow the supply chains, the suppliers, the delivery of armaments and goods to the U.S. Armed Forces and to our allies at the time as part of World War II. As you look at updating the arsenal of democracy, I would submit that while that was a preponderance of U.S. dominance in the arsenal of democracy from FDR's time, today's environment requires close collaboration with industrial bases here on the continent of Europe, for us over in the Indo-Pacific, as well as what we're doing within the United States. Our industrial base, as we've seen through, I would say, through the last 5 to 10 years, we have clearly seen the fragility that we have within supply chains as we've looked to lean those out over time. And then as we've seen over the last several years with Ukraine, it has placed an incredible demand on our ability to produce. And that can be in conventional munitions when you look at just the work that we've had to do to increase 155 production, all the way to some of the innovative technologies and drones and other things that startups have done, and how you can effectively scale. And you not only need to scale, obviously, but we're looking at doing that with speed and tempo. And so, from my capacity and what I do within the Army, but really nested within the larger OSD, is to look internationally and then here in Europe on how we can leverage what each country does for maximum benefit. I do come from the acquisition side, so while there is often discussion of capabilities, that is the what, and I deal with the how. And so the alignment of capital is always of focus to me, is how, understanding the demand signals that are placed out, we can properly aggregate those into what is needed within, whether it's regions bilaterally or trilaterally. And then obviously we've got to work financing and regulatory aspects of that as well, so that we can come together and look to scale with speed to meet the requirements. Certainly the last panel, or the last discussion with the Deputy Secretary General, I think she highlighted this extremely well. As we look at the funding targets of 5% with 3.5%, going to what I think she called the heavy metal that is out there. I again would state that each of us, whether it's the United States or other countries here in Europe, trying to do this without integrating and looking at how we collaborate is really an inappropriate approach in today's dynamic security environment. And so with that, I look forward to the discussion with the panel, and we can follow up in some of those areas. I certainly, if your questions get into then the how of how do we do that, what can we do, I certainly can talk about that, but I am a huge advocate of facilitating business-to-business dialogue that can help accelerate this as well. So.
We're definitely going to get to the how, because I can tell you from the defense industry, as I walked around the exhibit floor, that is the biggest question out there, is how, especially some of the smaller companies get in there. So we're going to get back to you on that. But Ms. Hagwall, if you could tell us a little bit, when you introduced yourself, you talked about FMV, but I just want to make sure the audience is more familiar with Sweden, and tell us about FMV and your insights on the co-production.
I'd love to do that. I'm looking forward to pick up on that on production capacity later. Yes, the Swedish Defence Materiel Administration, FMV, it's an independent agency under the Swedish Ministry of Defence. A bit special there, we have a special agency working with only procurement. But procurement, the main task is, of course, procurement for the Swedish Armed Forces. And we also support the armed forces with expertise and services in the maintenance of previously delivered material and system. We're also responsible for export activities when it comes to international agreements on government-to-government sales and other export issues when it comes to defense material. One task that has become a big task for us after Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the support to Ukraine. It's become one of our top priorities, and we put a lot of energy into it. And of course, it feels important. Sweden is a relatively small country, but with a strong defense industry. Even though it's a strong industry and it's high tech, I'd say, it does not meet the full need of our Swedish armed forces. So we need international cooperation, and we need procurement on the global market. But also the Swedish companies are very much active on the global market. So that means that we work, FMV as an agency, work closely together with allies and partners to secure our supply of defense material, to have access to essential knowledge and technologies. And we have an extensive international engagement that covers both bilateral relationships, but also different multilateral for us. If I could just say a few words on what we do to increase production capacity, and with the rapid increase in defense investment, of course, we see there is the demand is increasing rapidly, and we need to make the production capacity meet that demand. And you were talking about the demand signal. We're taking different measures nationally to increase the industrial production capacity, but also to support endurance and resilience in our supply lines. And one important task that we work quite a lot with is also to reestablish stockpiles of critical supplies and components. And I think one that we've come back to earlier today, or that was discussed earlier today, is the importance of broadening the industrial base, not only focusing on the traditional defense industry, but also involving the what we say civil sector, and also making sure that we don't only go for the big traditional industry companies, but also involving the small and medium-sized. Yes. Yeah. So one important task is to broaden the industrial base. The Swedish government recently decided on a new national defense and industrial strategy, and I think that's a good guide for us to look and to start as a support for us. We, of course, work a lot with the European Union. We take part in the different investment programs and is supporting it. It's an important way for us to strengthen the production capacity in Europe and the northern part of Europe. But I would also like to underline that we see a strong transatlantic link as very important. It's crucial for the development of the industrial base in Sweden, in Europe, and I'd say in the US as well. So the combination of working on a national level, European level, and on the transatlantic link or international, even with the Indo-Pacific, it's become important for us as one way. Let's think.
Yeah. So I'm already aware of some what I would call global industrial partnerships that Sweden has, but we're going to come back to you so you can think about that, because I would like to hear some examples of what you're doing as far as working with other countries right now, other industries. And again, I can say that our NATO, I think all of us will agree that our NATO alliance is much stronger now that Sweden has become part of NATO. So again, congratulations on that also. If I can go now back to Mr. Mason. how do you see burden sharing evolving through co-production efforts?
Yeah, so certainly, I will say burden sharing, but largely to whether it's co-production, but I'll really expand it into co-development as well as co-sustainment, has just massively expanded really over the last 2 years. It is infrequent that I have a conversation with an ally or partner, and typically for me it's an interaction that's really with the national armaments directors or like organizations like FMV where we interface with, where we don't immediately enter into a discussion of how we can collaboratively invest. And so when you think about burden sharing, to me it translates again to investment, and that's a dialogue that's been going on for the last several years. It is difficult at times to try to align our relative bureaucracies for funding timelines, policy adjustments, parliamentary and congressional approvals so that we can get that to align so that we can move forward. But I will tell you that there are some great examples that we have been able to execute over the last several years in a bilateral manner with countries where we are working collaboratively within that space. And to me, it demonstrates that burden sharing is not just a word, but it's actually being carried out in execution. And so I'll give you just an example. Is you take a look at some of the emerging firms that are using dual-use technology, whether it's someplace like Sweden where you've got a tremendous commercial market and you've got tremendous innovation that's going on, or other countries that are in Europe. We have aligned with several countries for co-investment into autonomous systems. And so looking at those and developing those, then we can collaboratively share between what I would say is the strengths of each of us as we work together. And then obviously we have to keep an eye on then, if that technology moves forward, obviously aligned to a capability requirement, then how do we effectively scale that? For a co-production side of the house, we've had good success, I would say globally, in building co-production and working through a lot of the exportability release issues and how we can build global supply chains. I will tell you that my focus on global production, there's often discussions on co-assembly, and co-assembly is very good, but ultimately it is the supply chain and the constraints that can grow total capacity. And so that is really the area of focus in co-production, is how you grow total capacity. Certainly you can start with an assembly facility, but it is really getting to that end state of increased capacity. And then last, we've had some good successes on depot level repair and return. Certainly discussions always turn to sustainment. As an acquisition professional, life cycle cost is consumed by sustainment costs when you look across total life cycle. And so as we see systems that we commonly share, how do we have repair and return facilities that will allow for a source of supply to multiple nations? And so we've been able to work through that now in several cases where we now have the ability to send, whether it is US or an ally or partner, into a forwardly located facility and then be able to do that repair and return and get that back out in service. And so, to me, when you asked the question, I didn't really answer the question because it was, how do you see burden sharing? But I think we all have an image of what burden sharing looks like, and I really wanted to provide some tangible examples of how I see that playing out in really the how we are going about doing that and the sharing that is going on between allies and partners.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, even when we use the word co-production, co-production means different things to different people. Yep. It can be, co-sustainment. It could be, there's so much, co-manufacturing, co-designing. I mean, so there's so many different, how we interpret, it's like a different language. I used to tell people when I was doing security cooperation for the world, they were like, why don't you speak, this language or this language? I'm like, I don't speak any of those languages, but I'm the best translator you'll ever meet. And they're like, what are you talking about, best translator? I'm like, I can listen to what operational or capability need you have, and I can translate it into Washington, D.C. bureaucracy language. And I tell you, it's an art form.
Yeah, and if I could, I want to just give an example of it because, we often think in terms of, as it was said earlier, the heavy metal and the end item that's there. we think about cutting edge technology in, say, autonomous systems. I talked a little bit about sustainment, but it's really down in the subcomponent level where there is great opportunity because of the expertise that exists. So when you look at the Nordics and you look at cold weather operations and you look at battery technology and how you can have battery life to be able to operate in those types of environment, it's something that we all converge back on, because you can say you want an autonomous system, but you need certain enablers to do that. And just down into battery technology is a great example of where the collaboration between, I will say, armaments groups and sharing of that information so that we can both move forward in something like that is absolutely vital.
Yeah. So before I turn to General Smith, I just want to say to the audience, I mean, a lot of times people come to these forums because they're really interested. They want to learn about renewing, modernizing the industrial base. But what I'd encourage all of you, I think there's other people that come to this because you have ideas of what new policies are needed, even what new laws are needed. So I'm going to do something a little bit non-traditional, as I think not only do I want to hear questions, collect those, but I'd also like suggestions. And even if I don't verbally bring them up today during the question and answer session, I think it's something your opinions, we need to leave with AUSA to be an advocate for this very time-critical need to renew and modernize our industrial base globally. So please feel free to write down your suggestions along with your questions for the panel here. So over to you, General Smith. Put the general hat on, not the Mr. hat that you've moved to. Can you give us a little bit about, from your operational experience and perspective, from your time at AFRICOM especially, how do we understand, what are the current requirements so that we can align this industrial base to modernize and renew and align to what the current requirements are?
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. So the U.S., quite honestly, has the advantage of being able to divide the world and the globe and how we look at it with combatant commands. Right? So each combatant command has an in-depth understanding based on the cultures, the geography, the environment, on kind of what requirements could and should look like. I think, obviously, to deal with the threats in that region. AFRICOM, no different. U.S. Africa Command, no different than any of the others. Interesting that both General Donahue yesterday, Sakier today, and many others have alluded to the global nature of kind of what we see, which means that requirements and capabilities are kind of very similar globally as well, although recognizing different environments that they have to operate in. So from the Africa Command perspective, and Heidi, you'll absolutely appreciate this, the principal driver towards our campaign plan was security cooperation and understanding from our African partners what did they need. And that was driven by their environment. It was driven by the threat or the risk that they saw. It was driven by the competitors or our adversaries that we saw in that region and what they were trying to accomplish. So I think it's, from that perspective, again, putting on a combatant command hat, it's understanding what your partners, allies in cases, are dealing with, what their concerns are, a deep understanding of their processes, and then being able to translate that, as you said, back into how do we provide that capability, whether it's through FMF, FMS, security cooperation, all the different, again, very familiar with all the different security cooperation and tools that we have to try and provide that. Interestingly, and again to the Deputy Secretary's comments, and the heavy metal is absolutely essential. However, we can't, and I know we don't, ignore what General Donahue described yesterday as, what is becoming the coin of the realm is data. And how do you manage data? Because the heavy metal doesn't do anything without the right data getting to the right people. And there are capabilities. I mean, industry is very much involved in how do you manage data, how do you digest data, how do you make it digestible, maybe better put, how do you plan, how do you work with allies and partners so that you are collaboratively interoperating, interacting, planning, and those, to me, that's part of the arsenal of democracy, is thinking about not just the metal and munitions, but how do you use that metal and munitions through the collaborative planning process, through understanding threats, all the way through to, kind of to exercises, which then helps drive requirements and capabilities because you see where your gaps are.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I can tell you, as again, walking around the last couple of days, this is one of the biggest things I've heard also is, from the industry perspective, they would like more specifics on what are the requirements. And last night I had the opportunity to facilitate a roundtable with the Ukraine Deputy Minister of Defense and a small amount of industry and U.S. government leaders. And it was fascinating hearing from Ukraine industry and the Deputy Minister in detail exactly what they need. And the conversation went to, well, how do we get that information to a larger group than the handful that were sitting at the round table? So this is something that, we're going to continue to work on, again, all of us collectively, on ensuring we know what the requirements are and make sure that that's open to both small and large industry, to make sure industry is putting their next dollar, their next investment, to make sure it's aligned with what it is that our warfighters need globally. And then vice versa, I can tell you, so it's just not industry, but I can tell you from experience in the government, as I worked with, global military leaders, I can't tell you how many of them used to say to me, look, we want to be a valued coalition partner. We've got somebody coming in telling us to buy more satellites. We have somebody coming in telling us to buy more fighter jets. Somebody who's saying undersea warfare. Can you just help us prioritize where we should put our next dollar as an international partner that would be the best value to the coalition? So it goes both ways. So again, I think this is something we all collectively need to work on to make sure that it's very clear what the priorities are, both for industry and international partners, so that we can keep this military edge that's needed for deterrence and to fight when needed. Okay, you can tell that's one of my passion topics. I'm going to come back then to Mr. Mason. Can you tell me what recent successes that you can highlight as far as Army co-production with our allies? Do you have some examples that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, so I sort of, as you asked me about burden sharing, I sort of jumped to some of the examples that we have out there and talk through. But I thought this would be a good segue to just talk a little bit about what led to the success. So I talked earlier and gave you some examples of burden sharing where we've got co-investment that's going on. And again, absolutely vital. It is a long pathway to actually be able to implement many of these things. And it may take years and years to go do that, particularly if the desire is to have a formalized government-to-government agreement that facilitates co-production. And so while those can be very important to have that formalized relationship, there are also an array of other, I will say, tools or methodologies in order to enable that. If there is a desire for those types of things, it can start more from a business-to-business relationship or some other relationship where one of the U.S. companies is involved, and then using that from manufacturing licensing agreements, direct commercial sales, layering those in. I still consider that all part of really the mosaic of co-production, ultimately leading to increased capacity either in production or in sustainment that gives us the ability to meet the demands that are out there. And so what I would encourage for countries that are listening and talking about it and trying to determine how they would like to move forward in some of this, understanding the criticality of sovereign jobs and sovereignty and spends within countries, is thinking broadly about how you can go about implementing this beyond just a government-to-government agreement, and what is it that you value most out of that, I'm going to say transaction, but out of that relationship. If you want to move quickly and you're interested in building industry and supply chains that can contribute, there are, I would say, opportunities to foster what I would say is that business-to-business relationship. And then in other cases where we can make it much more formalized, where we do have that bilateral agreement. So, I will go back to just some of the examples that we do see. I will tell you, I mentioned the co-assembly example earlier. However, when you look at the expansion of when companies come in and then start to work on critical supply chain limitations, that has been where we have seen the greatest benefit. And in many cases, that is simply us sending a good demand signal to industry on the need to expand total capacity, focusing in on critical path, what are the critical elements of the supply chain, and then working with, in this case, the EU and NATO to find where the right partnerships align, and then going back and figuring out how we can work through all the processes that are necessary to facilitate that.
So I want to pull on that a little bit. So currently, how is that demand signal getting out?
Yeah, so I think that's the biggest challenge that we have right now is actually having a consolidated demand signal. I know that it's been said is that industry knows exactly what we need and that industry should react and invest to that. But I do believe that the demand signal, and this is where we need to improve, is diluted between all of the different voices that are out there. And because of that dilution of the demand signal, it's really trying to figure out for businesses on how to close the business case. I often talk to our acquisition professionals to remind them that we are capitalists, right? We have free markets, and we've got to close the business case in the end to make that happen. And so how do we effectively send that signal out, and then it shows, in U.S. terms, how it shows procurement lines that facilitate the sale and the transaction that will occur from that. And just a quick example is, so in the United States, we have increased our guided MLRS production. That has been well publicized on the direction that that's going, 155 production going, but there is a whole litany of elements that are in the supply chain for that I would say do provide opportunity as it's announced and then funded that we plan to go do that. I would ask the question of how within Europe on certain critical munitions or its critical technologies or critical systems that are out there, how is that effectively communicated out that will then drive behavior and investment from industry?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, Ms. Hagwall, in your view, Sweden perspective, what can be done to scale up the co-production, and why is it so important from a view from Sweden?
Starting with the last part of the question, why is it important? I think the production capacity, it's part of the military capability. Production capacity is military capability, so a strong production capacity it's essential. I think maybe to add on to what you say, I say of course you can do co-production, business to business or business to government, but I think that maybe it should not be viewed only as a business agreement or a mechanism for tech transfer. I think it's a strategic arrangement that is necessary to meet the requirements for rearmament of Europe and NATO. And it's also building strategic partnership between countries and allies. So you have two different levels of what it brings. So I think that's an important thing to add. We need to improve the industrial capacity across Europe, NATO, but I also think that the Indo-Pacific as a part of that production capacity and the increases is one way to look at it globally and make sure that we use the whole thing. I think, simply put, two factories producing parts is better than one. So it's a very simple way to put it. But I think it's a venture that takes both industry and government to work together. It's not something that will happen by itself. We have one example with the CV90, but also the CATV, the all-terrain vehicle, where we come together, different countries, adding more, doing procurement together, adding more, and the volume increases. The demand increases, but in volume and over time. And that made it possible to also invest in the production capacity, which was good. and successful. So coming back to one, you talked about the demand signal, and to be more specific and sharp in the demand signal, I'll say one word that comes to me is transparency. That's important, but transparency and trust, and that's really a word that is sometimes challenging in this business. But we need to be transparent with our needs between government and industry, and also between government to government, in a way to coordinate our efforts. And that's also, I think, also to be transparent industry to industry, so that they can find each other. The one that have the good idea find the other one, and where they can complement or co-produce. So transparency is one word that I think we need to stick to.
Yeah,
which is challenging for...
Exactly. I've heard transparency, trust, kind of, you're hearing those themes over the last couple of days, which, let me go then to General Smith on this. There's some really amazing small companies out there. I've been doing some work with venture capital, and to see a lot of these innovative companies that want to get into the defense business and share their technologies, but they just don't know, like, who do they go to? How do they get into the system and make sure that the decision makers are aware of the technologies? Can you share a little bit, some advice to us on where those companies should go to share their technologies?
Yeah, you bet. I'd like to go back though real quick and kind of talk about the transparency piece, or at least provide it, from my perspective, an overly simplistic view. And that's because I suppose my background, much of what happens is transactional, which is a relationship. And if you're lucky, you can get to a partnership where you have shared goals, and each side benefits equally, if you will. And there's a desire to see, kind of that effort to an endpoint. And if you're really lucky, you get to a friendship, which is, to your point, ma'am, which really talks about trust and risk, accepting risk, which is what an alliance is. An alliance is a friendship. So you kind of think about, how do you take advantage of that? Within the nations, within the militaries, that's a lot easier for us to understand. Within industry, that's tougher. Understand, but to your point, sir, we're capitalist. There's competitiveness there, which is important. At the same time, we kind of heard, again, some of the senior leaders talk about the interoperability and the ability to interact. So how do we have industry, whether it's developing software, whether it's developing hardware, similar capabilities, how do we have them at the right time and place interact to address those needs? So to your question, Heidi, specifically, similar, I've sat through a handful of venture capital portfolio reviews and heard from founders as they kind of ask the questions: how do I get my capability, what I think is the next new thing, the disruptive innovation, in front of the people who would then define that requirement and ask for it? My advice to them is kind of typically attend events like this, right? So you can hear what the requirements or what the operational needs are, and then you have the ability to get that out in front of, on a floor, for example, as people walk through and see what you have to offer. I touched on this very briefly in the previous comments. When you are able to get it to someone as a test case, exercises are a great way to kind of to war game that. Does that capability work? Does your user see, the end user see the benefit of it? I will show my background colors here: special operations, helicopter pilot. My experience from a tactical, operational, strategic is SOF is much more willing to accept risk in trying new capabilities. They can do that because scale and size, right? It's easier for them to take on that new capability, and if it's not successful, then they have not invested that much. So if you can get your capability, again, showing my colors here, to a SOF entity, they will try it out, see if it works, and then that individual nation will determine whether that's scalable to their general purpose force, for example. So that's some of the advice I give, is kind of think about who are you trying to target with your capability, so that they can then advertise it for you.
Go ahead.
If I could, go ahead.
I think that that's also a challenge for the government or the procurement part of the defense sector. We talk a lot about innovation when it comes to technology, but I think we also need to innovate our procurement processes.
Absolutely.
To make sure that we really get access to these new companies. So that it's a challenge for the companies to meet, to get access to a military problem, but we should also make sure that we use procurement methods that we really open up.
Yeah. So I mean, there's the old cliche of you can get it fast, cheap, or good. Pick two. Right? And I think we're figuring that out. And how do you actually bring that three-legged stool together so that you don't have to pick between speed, capability, and cost? And we're getting better at that. Yep.
Yeah, I did want to go back just a second to the critical comment you made, Eva, which was about the strategic partnership that this represents. And just talk about that a little bit in the context of how that then facilitates business relationships and everything else, because I absolutely agree with that. And so to give you an example, as one of the forums, and we do this with Sweden Land Forces as well in FMV, is our Senior Cooperation Forum Armaments, or Army, where we come together and we really talk in a transparent manner about what we're trying to do and then look for opportunities that we can collaborate on. And that is codified in a government-to-government agreement, an RDT&E agreement that we have that represents a strategic partnership. And I believe that it is through those strategic partnerships and the way that we have aligned with it that we can then drive some of the collective demand signals. And whether that is done in a bilateral relationship with the United States, or it is done within the Nordics or the Baltics or the Balkans, those are all the types of relationships that, in coming together in a strategic framework, can then drive the types of outcomes that we're looking for in increasing total capacity in a number of different ways. And so I did want to go back to that, because I do believe that those are incredibly important. And then back to the alliance, the strategic importance of the NATO Army Armaments Group and STANAGs is very important. And believe me, if you've ever been to those meetings and if you've ever worked on a STANAG, it is quite tedious. One would say maybe watching paint dry. It is long, it is difficult, but they are so absolutely important, because it is through that, or through some of the interoperability standards that we develop through it, that then foster the ability to go out and have a competitive environment, but also send out a clear understanding of what industry needs to build to. You know, I think back to things that were done well before my time, but in the 1970s, we're just coming to an alignment on how to refuel armored vehicles, right? And being able to do that effectively, absolutely vital for NATO. And when you look at the information domain, the data domain, that is exactly what is necessary now as we go forward. But through that, I believe that we can then send the right demand signals, much like we were able to do in the 70s, and something that sounds rather innocuous, but absolutely vital, which is how do you actually have standard nozzles for refuel?
Yeah, I want to just add a little bit to, how getting into exercises and defense companies. I think all of us know from the U.S., and every country has their own policies or constraints to this, but how do you choose which company of the 100+ that have drone capability now to bring into an exercise? I know that there's a lot of people are afraid. They don't want to show favoritism to one company or another. So this is one of, again, those challenges that we have that we need to work through. And having maybe an industry day focused on drones where you open it up to all, so everybody's welcome. I mean, we need to look at how we get at this and be able to see all the technology that's out there and everything's available. The other thing I wanted to comment on the exercises is from my experience, and I'm sure it's improved since my time doing this, but you go to exercises, multinational exercises, and lessons learned would come out of these multinational exercises, and they'd go into the database. And then what? And I remember when I was, Air Force International Affairs, I'd say after a red flag, I'm like, could I get that information? Because Then I can go have a conversation with that country to say, it looks like you have this type of need out of that exercise. Let me help you. See how we can navigate and get that capability or capacity that was a lesson learned. So somehow having that feedback loop out of the exercises, back to industry, back to the decision makers. Yeah.
And what we need to do is to shorten that loop.
Right.
It cannot go through a data system. It must be, I think, more
immediate.
On the spot.
And I can tell you, once I started asking the question to the operators, they're like, look, you can come and observe the exercise. You're welcome. And I think it's just a matter of us asking, can we be there to see how whatever equipment is that we're providing in the exercise, how is that working out for you? And get real-time feedback. So I think, again, inserting ourselves, not waiting sometimes for the answer to come back and shorten that loop, like you said, is a really good point. So I was going to say, I'm going to go now, hopefully, so you can get some more. I know you guys have so much more to share with us, but to some of your questions. So thank you for the questions. There's some thoughtful ones that I want to bring up. The first one, I'm going to open it to any of the panelists, but it says the NATO Army Armaments Group has the role of facilitating capability development to ensure the alliance has the capability requirements to fight and win. Other than information exchange, what's the best way to facilitate capability development? So it sounds like, again, they're looking for some type of process, somehow back to getting to capability development.
I'll defer to you.
Being the newcomer to NATO, yeah. I think what you said earlier. I think all of you mentioned it. Exercises. It's a good way to learn about the needs and the capabilities needed as a starting point.
So, I think often when you come together, because if I understand the question correctly, it was really about how do you foster collaborative capability development, and it also talked about how the NATO Army Armaments Group could be part of that as well. Did I understand that correctly?
That sounds right. And if Jason wants to get up and give us a little more clarification.
Yeah.
We're going to bring you a mic.
1 second, we're bringing the mic.
So we can all
Thanks
hear.
for being willing to stand up, Jason.
Yeah, thanks.
Quite welcome. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
So the NATO Army Armaments Group, what we try to do, and I'm the advisor to the group, and we've got 8 capability groups. All are looking at different challenges and capability shortfalls that nations have based off of the capabilities that were identified through planning processes, specifically the DDA family of plans that we've heard so much about over the last couple of days. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, if we're looking short, medium, long term, how do we connect the scientists, the operators, and industry, get them in a room, get them talking, but I'm trying to figure out what it is, what's the delivery, what's the end of the conference. And so it shouldn't just be the exchange of ideas, but we want to have something that gets back to the hardware. And so how does that then get translated to the nations? And so how does that get fed back into some type of development process that's happening with industry? Because right now, the only thing I'm seeing inside that group, and again, it's probably my fault. I'm the advisor to the group, right? I've only been in the job for about 6 months, though, so I'll use that for another month. But it's, how do we have some type of tangible end and say, hey, here's a capability that this group has taken a look at in terms of developing, go forth and do great things with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And certainly I really appreciate your comments, Jason, because to what Heidi said earlier is getting your feedback is really important, and I look forward to the continued feedback. I think that's something I'll take back to Brigadier Chris King, right, who is chairing the NOG now. I would agree with you that while I will say the 70s or 80s, we had a period where the group came together and really looked at what I will call those interoperability standards that facilitated the integration of forces. And then it kind of drifted along in time, to be blunt. And so we're at a critical juncture right now where I do think there is the opportunity. Does it lead to a capability development, or does it lead to what I would say are critical interoperability standards that then drive what you put in your solicitations to industry? And, happy to have that discussion with Chris and talk about it. But I think in many cases, if the NOG can inform what we collectively want to put in solicitations, it is just another element that sends out a consolidated demand signal. Because the demand signal doesn't have to be, I want to buy X amount of rockets, or I want to buy X amount of drones or something. It can say, I want these types of, I'll use drones as an example, that have these types of, let's say, interoperability standards, so that I can have multiple manufacturers in multiple different countries that are doing that have the performance attributes that I want, and then also the interoperability so that I can share data and information off of that platform. So just some of my thoughts on this, because I do believe, and I'm really excited that Chris is leading the organization right now. I think he's a fantastic leader that really has some really brilliant ideas on how to move the group forward and deliver some tangible outputs. So thanks very much for your question.
Yeah, so I'll share with you. This is just a U.S. example, not a NATO example, but I used to, as when my bio is read, I was the CENTCOM J8, I was the AFRICOM J8, and how I used to get things funded that were requirements for whatever command I was working for is I spent more time building relationships within the U.S. government than I did, outside with our partners and allies. And what I do is talk to the other combatant commanders and say, look, this is what I'm hearing is the number one operational capability need in this theater. Let's all go in together, and if we could kind of coordinate our top three, typically they would then be funded by the services if we all collectively said those are all our top three requirements. So somehow trying to get into the decision makers, whether it's in the different countries who acquisition authorities or within the U.S. acquisition requirements process, to make sure that it's getting into the process. And again, timing is critical, as you know. The 2-year cycle from planning, budgeting cycle, and just trying to get into that loop is so important. There are urgent needs processes, but again, Mr. Mason and the U.S. system can definitely help with the U.S. system. But I just wanted to share that's one of the things is just building those relationships, knowing who to go to, when to go to make sure that they know what the requirements are. All right, so I'm going to go on. Thanks again for clarification on that. So again, to all the panelists, and this kind of is going to be a good lead into the next panel on foreign military sales. But while FMS foreign military sales provides a mechanism for government-to-government cooperation, many of the technologies being requested are not program of records, which requires industry to acquire licenses through BIS or Department of State. This is a slow process, and there's a feeling that there's no champion for that process. So who within NATO, U.S. Army Europe, U.S. government is overwatching the process to ensure the process doesn't continue to be slow?
I should just defer back to you,
Heidi. The next panel? No, I'm kidding.
I would defer back to Heidi because Heidi ran DITSA and she ran DSCA, so you have much more insight. I mean, just real quickly, because this seems a pretty U.S.-centric topic on really just non-programs of record. What I will say is I do believe that we are shifting, except for very capital-intense systems where the capital costs to build that are substantial enough, we probably won't call it a program of record. It's a shift back to as General George talked about earlier this week, adopt, modify, or develop as 3 buying modalities that we have. And we've shifted much more, given the commercial technologies, into that just adopt. But then when you try to go internationally with that and you do not have a program of record, I certainly recognize that that creates unique challenges in how do you work through, I will say, exportability or the ITAR constraints associated with it. I won't give you a specific answer, but I will say as part of the executive order that was put out for FMS reform, that is actually part of it is ITAR reform and how we can successfully accelerate the processes. And it is an interagency process that requires movement from, depending on the nature of technology, from DoD and your old organization in DITSA up through the Department of State and then over for these commercial technologies to commerce and biz that's got to go do that. I will say I am hopeful. DSCA used to talk about, I think we've had, over the last 15 years, we've had 15 different FMS reform panels that have been formed. I am hopeful that this opportunity, the confluence of events that are going on, and the security environment really drives us to really take a look at the ITAR policies and the statute that's associated with it and the opportunities to open up that a bit. I don't know, you've got a lot of experience in this.
Yeah, I was going to say, this was something, a non-program of record. Defense Security Cooperation Agency is your point in the U.S. government. So you need to go to Defense Security Cooperation Agency. I would start there and say, I have this non-program of record. Because what I've seen happen is some of our international partners send in a request to one of the services, and it's a non-program of record, and it gets shuffled around. Somebody trying to figure out, okay, who's the program lead for AI? Well, it's not there, as a general statement, and we don't have this program. So it's DSCA's responsibility then, if it's a non-program of record, to assign a service to take the lead, to put manpower on it, and they do have the ability, DSCA, to use admin funds to give to the service to hire staff or employees or set up a program office to do this type of work. So that would be my recommendation to the person asking, is Defense Security Cooperation Agency for non-program of record, and hold them accountable. I can say that now, I'm not leading it, but anyway, so I'm going to go on to the next question. The next one is also about foreign military financing. So we've repeatedly heard we must increase the speed of the procurement cycle. It's important. The question is, and I think this is part of what you talked about, the executive order that came down for foreign military sales. And I think this is beautiful, by the way. There's 2 executive orders that came down. One was to reform the foreign military sales process in the U.S. and to reform and modernize the acquisition process. That's what's unique about what's happening right now. It hasn't happened at the same time ever before. It hasn't happened from the top, coming from the President of the United States, to get the entire interagency, everybody together to work at these. So I want to say it's promising, as Mr. Mason said, that there might be some things being done. But specifically, what the question is, what are we doing to hold the PEOs, and again, this is U.S.-centric, accountable to deliver? And I'm going to expand on this a little bit, because I used to feel the same way, where we started tracking in the foreign military sales process from the time a requirement submitted, the letter of request, to when we finished the letter of offer and acceptance. But when you try to track down how much time did it take and who's responsible to get it on contract, trying to get that data and hold that part of the process accountable wasn't existent at the time. But I believe the Army has done something about that.
Yeah, I could, sorry, it's centric to kind of what I do on a daily basis, but I mean,
don't feel targeted, by the way.
No, I don't.
There's a drone above your head.
I don't feel targeted. I could talk about this till people didn't want me to talk about it anymore, which might be now. So I came into this out of a PEO about 3 years ago, and certainly I had frustrations with the FMS system, not just ITAR and the interagency process, but just the way that we executed cases. And that's coming from somebody who I joke around because I've done everything from an assistant product manager, up through a PEO, and then I was the acting acquisition executive for a little bit. And so I would go to these meetings, and I was working on Apache, and I would look, and there would be 25 people in the room, all from the Army, and they were just there to kind of supervise me as I was trying to execute this program. And I say this from 20 plus years ago, where I would become frustrated, and I'm like, what does everybody do in this process, right? And I'm sure other folks have asked that question. And so, part of what I wanted to make sure when I came in 3 years ago, that we really took a look at the way that we were arrayed organizationally, but ultimately it led to who do we assign accountability to. Because you've got these layers that have existed within the system for, say, 40 years. And so we've set about the term that I use, kind of delayering the bureaucracy. Really great people, really super individuals that are out working, but how do we best optimize what they're doing and get them engaged in execution? And so that's what we have been working through, that then assigns what we refer to as the Security Systems Program Manager, 4 cases down to whoever should best execute that. And so I will say if you're buying Strikers, that is PEO Ground Combat System. That will be assigned to PEO Ground Combat System, just like Stryker is for a U.S. Army program, and they will be accountable for delivery of that and integration of that as you go through. That sounds rather simplistic, and why didn't we do that beforehand? But it just wasn't the way that it was done. I will also tell you, associated with, I will say, the clear accountability down to the PEO, or if it's somebody else that in the logistics system, they will have that given to them, and then they will be resourced to go out and execute that, and then that can be the means to hold that accountability. I will add one thing is, we've also ensured that the programmatic rigor that is required for execution, cost schedule, performance integrated master schedules, if you're an acquisition professional, all of those things that we do for U.S. Army programs are absolutely required for our FMS programs now. They are not handled differently in that, what I'll say is that black hole between LOA and delivery. We fill that in to make sure that it's aligned with Army process and rigor that goes into program execution. So,
I think maybe because I recognize the discussion very much. I think wherever you start discussing procurement and procurement processes, it's not in the most positive. It doesn't sparkle always. And we've had the same discussions in Sweden about procurement process and how we can make it faster and more relevant. I think because that's maybe the most important thing, to have a process that's relevant. Does this step, decision point, add value, or is it just there for some reason that was made sense 20 years ago? We've looked through our process and we realized we can remove points and parts and decision points and make it faster. But it's not easy. There are stakeholders that think that this is really an important decision or a point. But to look through the process and remove steps that are not necessary, not adding value. But I also say, if we want to increase the procurement loop, once again, maybe it's about trust. Something that was good enough for Finland should be good enough for Sweden. Something that's good enough for other allies should be good enough, and then we can shorten the process maybe. So reduce the national requirements to a minimum is also maybe one way to increase the speed. I think.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and I will just add, having a background in what used to be called SORDAC, so I sort of grew up in SORDAC. The trade space on requirements was absolutely vital. And so when you are looking at going fast, how do you look at, shall I say, good enough, not as good as it could be, such that it can meet operational requirements? You can iterate on it as it continues to field in an iterative fashion as you go through that. And absolutely agree that to me is one immediate way that you can accelerate, field, and initial capability, then be able to build on that as you go forward.
Yeah, so I think, again, back to my soft background, with U.S. Special Operations Command having its own acquisition authority, not going through a service, a lot more of that buy, try, decide mentality, right? Is this capability giving me what I think? Am I going to be able to scale it? Is it scalable? Will production be able to do that? So I think that's there, but there's risk, right? And all of those conversations, there's always risk that you have to think about from, especially as resources become more constrained. Your stakeholders, Congress in the U.S.'s case, will pay attention.
So another question, comment that I've heard in the last couple of days is many of the speakers have pointed to industry and said, okay, now it's your time to surge. You need to go faster, to industry. And there was a comment that, by SAC, you're saying that, okay, that now NATO has agreed to 5%, so that should be your signal. Go ahead, industry, move out. So I would just like to know your perspectives on that and what you're hearing from industry about why they're not moving out, even though there's this demand signal.
I think you commented on it earlier that the demand signal need to be more specific maybe for a company to invest in production capacity. And I'm sure that they need to be able to make the business case. And the business case is when you have maybe the order or something close to that. So a contract. If you need to invest and you need to have financing for your investment, then you need owners or bank or a financial system to back your investment, and then you need to have a business case that's really valid. And I can understand that the intention of increasing the defense spending is not enough for a company further down the line. So Sakura also said we should hold ourselves accountable, and I think it's a challenge for us as nations to take the 3.5% or 5% and make it possible to deliver on it, make it possible for the companies to do the necessary investments in production capacity. It's something that we do together. It's not governments. It's not only the companies, but we'd like to see the companies joining it.
Yeah. I think that was the one thing that I noticed too, is that the company needs the actual contract requirement. I can tell you with munitions shortfalls, I've been working munitions shortfalls since 2010 personally, where a lot of the nations in the past historically have relied on excess stockpiles that the U.S. haven't been able to draw down on them real time in the past. Well, those stockpiles are no longer there to draw down on. So it takes making sure that it's a written requirement as soon as the requirement's identified so that the industry can get their production facilities up and running. So that, there isn't, the shareholders out there with the private sector aren't going to like it if they start investing in things when there's no requirement documented on the table. So I think that's just something we need to talk about and understand. Maybe there's a new model out there where the risk is shared between the government and industry. Now, these are the types of things that I think are important for us to go forward and talk about in this new environment. So what I'm going to do now is, this is a fun part. I like to call it the call to action. So this is your opportunity to share with the audience what you would say, because we've got people from industry, we've got uniformed, we've got civilian service leaders. What would you say is the call to action that collectively, with international partners, that we need to do to really modernize and renew our industrial base going forward to meet, for the deterrence and, if needed, for a war?
I can start. Yeah, sure. I would start with turning to industry companies, deliver on the existing contracts that you have. That is essential. We come back to that a lot in Sweden, but we can discuss future contracts, but the most important thing maybe is to deliver on what we have on hand. After that, I'd say I come back to transparent with needs or the consolidated demand signal. We need to be more specific on the demand signal in order to make investment possible. Aggregate demand and have longer timelines for companies to be able to invest in capacity. I come back to the existing contracts and maybe also using existing production capacity more efficiently by reducing national requirements. Then we have interoperability, interchangeability, but also a production line that will run more smoothly. We've talked about broadening the industry base a bit, involving industry that's not the traditional. I think that's something. It's something that I need to do more. What we've not talked so much about today is innovation. And innovation, we often refer to technology and bringing in new technology, but I think it's important for us to also innovate how we do business, the business models and how we procure. It's not only the technological innovation that we need to focus on. So transparent with needs, using existing production in efficient manners, broaden industry base, and innovative procurement methods maybe.
Thank you. I appreciate that. General Smith.
Yeah, so I'm going to riff off of the innovation comment, and that is for a call to industry, call to those who are thinking about the future is, so we have absolutely seen drones change the nature of warfare in the past 3 years. And it was coming before that, but we've absolutely seen that at scale. What's after drones? What's next? Yeah. Who is thinking about what is that next thing? And this is a plea, if you will, to some of the founders that I've sat through, again, portfolio reviews with venture capital firms. What is next? What are we thinking about changes the nature of warfare significantly in the way that we've seen it with drones? And again, some of our senior leaders have talked about that. Absolutely, information warfare. How do you control that? How do you manage that? And in some cases, mitigate it.
Thank you. Mr. Mason?
Yeah, so I think something you said, and clearly from the acquisition side, I refer to it as deliver on commitments. Right? I often talk about just my role internationally, and when we're doing FMS is ultimately we deliver on commitments. That's what we've got to do. But I would say for industry and for us collectively, we have a demand that we can't satisfy right now. We are trying to expand rapidly, and we put things on contract, and we have to deliver on those commitments. There are a lot of challenges in growing the supply chains and the base for it. But it's something that we have to go do, and we have to be transparent about where we are. The second, in the near term, if you look at time horizons, is adaptive approaches using existing technology. We've seen that clearly from Ukraine, where we've been able to take things and I will say cobble them together to create a unique capability that we didn't think we had, and yet has worked exceptionally well in defeating the threat. And those are the types of approaches that, given the existing tech that we have, I don't want to call that as much of the innovation space in new technologies, but the innovation in bringing technologies together that actually create these unique solutions that in many cases can be very, very cost effective, and they can maneuver with speed. And then lastly, I will talk about partnerships that allow you to innovate at scale. Many companies that are out there, and the small startups and the companies that are trying to deal with cash flow issues every single month because of how difficult it is to work with the government, they have fantastic ideas. The government can try to move them along to a certain extent, but those unique partnerships that can exist, that we can help because of the strategic alignments that we have, can facilitate that, what I refer to as innovation, those innovative concepts, and then the production or the other processes that are necessary to scale that, to deliver it. Because when we look at the global demand that we have, the United States, along with NATO, it is a scale problem in the end. How can we effectively scale to meet that demand?
Thank you for that. So one thing I want to leave you with is, if you can think about this analogy, you heard today about NATO and the strength of our alliance. There's nothing like it as far as the strength of our military alliance that we have. So my vision is, out of this discussion from the panel today, is why can't we do the same thing with an alliance of our defense industry? So that would be my call to action. is we come back here a year from now and we talk about the strength of our global industrial base being unmatched, something that our allies can't even come close to having the edge, because we take the strength of each one of our industry partners globally and bring that together just like the strength of our military alliance. So again, please give a hand to this awesome panel.